What's your favorite scary movie? It's a question we've heard in our lives, and in the movies themselves, of course. There are plenty of answers. Mine is John Carpenter's Halloween from 1978. Many others would likely choose A Nightmare on Elm Street, maybe The Exorcist. But I bet if you polled like 100 people with this question, a lot of them, and I mean a lot, would probably choose Stanley Kubrick's 1980 horror masterpiece The Shining, starring Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. This incredible feat of filmmaking from one of the masters is considered a landmark in the genre today, and it's one I happily rewatch almost every Halloween season. It's unlike any horror film ever made. The long, unsettling tracking shots, the quiet, growing sense of dread, the setting, the score, Jack effing Nicholson. This movie succeeds in pretty much every way it can, and so nobody would blame you if you assume The Shining probably got some Oscar nominations. Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress. What about cinematography, editing, score, sound? Like, this monumental achievement in cinema history must have shown up somewhere, right? As I've explored in many videos the last few weeks, the Academy is not necessarily averse to recognizing genre movies. They gave Psycho some big nominations in 1961. They nominated Carrie for Best Actress and Best Supporting Actress. The Exorcist got a whopping 10 Oscar nods back in 1974, including Best Picture and Best Director, as it should have. The Shining is as good, as powerful, as captivating as The Exorcist, I would argue, and yet, I'm sure you knew this was coming. At the 53rd Academy Awards on March 31st, 1981 in the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, there was no mention of The Shining. There was no Jack Nicholson in the front row wearing his trademark shades. There was no Best Director nomination for Stanley Kubrick, who at that time was coming off of 4 Best Director Oscar nominations in a row, going back 16 years.
Stanley Kubrick for Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb.
Sadly, at the 1981 Oscars, The Shining was a non-entity. This amazing film didn't receive a single nomination. How did this happen? Why was one of the greatest horror films of all time completely shut out of the Academy Awards? My name is Brian Rowe, this is the Awards Contender, and in today's video, we're merging 2 of my series for the first time, Horror and the Oscars, and Oscar Fiasco, to explore why The Shining came up short during the 1981 award season and was pretty much only recognized by a single awards body, one that may surprise you. To get things started, let's go back to the project's origins. After the box office disappointment of 1975's Barry Lyndon, Stanley Kubrick decided to look for a project that could be more commercially viable, and he became interested in the idea of making a horror film. Kubrick reportedly reading the beginning of many horror novels in search of material. The one he kept reading was The Shining, Stephen King's 3rd published novel, about a novelist Jack who takes a winter season job overseeing an isolated hotel with his wife Wendy and son Danny, his little boy having some supernatural powers. King's first book, Carrie, became a critical and commercial hit film in 1976, one that, as I said, got into the Oscars, and his second book, Salem's Lot, was adapted into a popular TV miniseries in 1979. A film version of The Shining must have seemed like a no-brainer to Kubrick, especially after he connected to the story and characters and wanted to make a film that explored the dark side of humanity. Kubrick got his first choices for the 2 leads, Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall, committing to the project early in the process, but he had a hell of a time finding the right young actor to play Danny. 5,000 boys reportedly interviewed for the role over a 6-month period. Before Danny Lloyd got the part, Scatman Crothers rounded out the slim cast of major characters, production on the movie commencing at Elstree Studios in southern England in May 1978 and wrapping in July 1979. Gee, a 15-month shoot for Kubrick, how surprising. Not really. The man was known for taking his sweet time, never more so when he apparently demanded 127 takes of Shelley Duvall walking backward up the stairs with the baseball bat. The Shining was one of the first films to use the newly developed Steadicam camera, which allowed for smooth tracking shots, like the one that follows Danny speeding through the hotel on his tricycle. Post-production went late into 1979 and early 1980, where reportedly a much longer cut was screened at least once, featuring multiple deleted scenes. A story about this film that's always fascinated me is that after The Shining's world premiere and first week's run in May 1980, Kubrick cut out an entire ending scene where Wendy is in the hospital and informed by Mr. Ullman that Jack's body couldn't be found. Projectionists everywhere were forced to remove the scene and return it back to Warner Brothers, and it's never been viewed since, although a few pictures have surfaced online. The Shining opened the same weekend as The Empire Strikes Back, released on 10 screens and earning $622,000, the third highest grossing opening weekend at the time ever from fewer than 50 screens. And by the end of summer 1980, The Shining had earned more than $40 million, making it a modest, although not spectacular, box office success in light of its $19 million budget. So why did The Shining look to potentially have a shot at some big Oscar nominations? Here are the three main reasons. The first reason was, of course, its writer-director Stanley Kubrick, who was no stranger to the Oscars. For decades, the Academy didn't seem to care what genre Kubrick made his movies in. Black comedy, science fiction, period costume drama, they still nominated him over and over. He got 3 Oscar nods in 1965 for Dr. Strangelove, an additional 3 nods in 1969 for 2001: A Space Odyssey, where he won, oddly enough, his only Academy Award for the film's special effects.
Mr. Kubrick unfortunately cannot be with us tonight, so we'll have his Oscar delivered tomorrow.
And then in the 1970s, wouldn't you know it, 3 more Oscar nominations for A Clockwork Orange and 3 Oscar nods for Barry Lyndon. I mean, that is an incredible run if you think about it. Has it ever been matched in the history of the Academy Awards? One person nominated 3 times, every time, for 4 movies in a row? Like, they clearly adored him and his work, not to say that Kubrick ever showed up to a ceremony. The man apparently didn't like to fly, but oh, would I have loved to have seen his Oscar acceptance speech for Best Special Effects for 2001: A Space Odyssey. It probably would have been about as long as Alfred Hitchcock's speech for his Irving G. Thalberg Oscar.
Thank you.
So yeah, I feel like that astonishing Oscar run proved that the man could do no wrong in the eyes of the Academy, and even if he was going to make a scary movie for the first time, a genre the Academy doesn't always like, they were still going to keep his name in the conversation.
He wanted to take us places we could never have imagined, and so he imagined them for us. He is Stanley Kubrick. He dared us to have the courage of his convictions. And when we take that dare, we're transported directly to his world, and we're inside his vision. And in the whole history of movies, there's been nothing like that vision ever.
The second reason The Shining had a shot at Oscar was the film's star Jack Nicholson, who the Academy couldn't stop throwing nominations at all throughout the 1970s. Nicholson, who still to date holds the record for male actor with the most Oscar nominations, 12 total, attended the Oscars as a nominee a whopping 5 times between 1970 and 1976. His first nomination was in the Best Supporting Actor category for Easy Rider, and then he showed up in Best Actor for 5 Easy Pieces, The Last Detail, Chinatown, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And after many losses in quick succession, Nicholson finally won the Gold Trophy for his iconic performance in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
I read the book when it was originally published. Of course, I was too young to play the part then, but I've always liked this character. I don't think an actor can go wrong really playing a combination of Hamlet and Christ.
Between that film and The Shining, Nicholson appeared in 3 movies, The Missouri Breaks, The Last Tycoon, and Goin' South, but a new epic horror film from director Stanley Kubrick? I'm sure there were many who thought Nicholson had a solid chance of returning to the Oscars in the Best Actor category. And then the third reason I would argue is the film's superior quality. It's a clear standout in the year in film that was 1980. It was unlike anything in the marketplace, certainly in the summer season, and people were definitely seeing it considering it made about $45 million. After a 5-year absence, Stanley Kubrick was back with a studio film starring one of the biggest movie stars in the world, based on one of the runaway best-selling novels of the era. The Shining, especially today, feels like a movie that should have been a major Oscar contender in 1981, so what the hell went wrong? Why was The Shining an Oscar fiasco? I would argue 3 things. The first was the definitely lackluster critical reception at the time, which frustratingly destroyed much of The Shining's Oscar prospects very early in its run. Janet Maslin in the New York Times wrote, "Even the film's most startling, horrific images seem overbearing and perhaps even irrelevant." The critic at Variety said, "Kubrick has teamed with jumpy Jack Nicholson to destroy all that was so terrifying about Stephen King's bestseller." Gene Siskel gave the film 2 out of 4 stars, calling it a crushing disappointment, and Roger Ebert was also negative, saying it was hard to connect to the characters, although Ebert did reappraise the film in the 2000s with a 4-star review. And then there was Pauline Kael of The New Yorker, whose opinion meant a lot at the time. She wrote, "Again and again, the movie leads us to expect something, almost promises it, and then disappoints us. Hell, even Stephen King has famously rejected this movie over and over again."
There are other times when I feel as though I'd given Stanley Kubrick a live grenade and he heroically threw his body on it.
So yeah, the critics, the people who mattered in 1980, said no to Kubrick's film, and it's really difficult for any movie to weather that for months and still get into the Academy Awards. The second reason was the May release date, which first off seems like a weird and inappropriate time of year to put this movie out anyway, but that time of year is also notoriously not a very Oscar-friendly time. We see films released in the first half of the year go on to do well at the Academy Awards here and there. It was the case recently for Everything Everywhere All at Once. It was the case for The Silence of the Lambs famously, which had come out way back in February. It was even the case for Kubrick's own Doctor Strangelove and 2001: A Space Odyssey, which came out near the beginning of their respective years. But for the most part, a release later in the year does often help, the way it did for both A Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon, released by Warner Brothers in December of their respective years. I don't know if a December 1980 release date for The Shining would have necessarily helped its Oscar chances by much. Like, maybe it could have picked up a technical nomination or two, maybe Kubrick could have gotten into Best Director, but the stains of those negative critical reviews, by the end of 1980, The Shining was basically DOA when it came to award season. Because, let's face it, the third major reason, this is a horror film, and not just any horror film, a supernatural ghost story that goes to some very weird and unexpected places. It's at times an eerie mood piece, it can be darkly funny, it can be sexual and grisly and incredibly frightening. The Shining came off as a disappointment to most critics at the time, obviously, but also, let's face it, even if the reviews had been stronger, I do think so much of the unsettling imagery in The Shining would have been way too much for the Academy anyway. Like, both The Exorcist and Carrie, which they embraced, have supernatural elements, but The Shining, with all its beautiful nuttiness in that third act, it just wasn't going to happen. The Academy, which at that time embraced Ordinary People as the best movie of the year, was never going to go for The Shining, especially in the early 1980s when they pretty much pushed against every genre movie, outside of maybe Best Original Score or Best Makeup. So yeah, in 1981, the Oscars snubbed The Shining in every category. There was absolutely room for Nicholson in Best Actor, but no. Kubrick could have taken Roman Polanski's slot in Best Director for Tess. We could have taken out The Formula in Best Cinematography too, but sadly The Shining was nowhere to be found, and that was also the case for the Golden Globe Awards and the BAFTA Awards. Like, that's kind of crazy as well. I mean, BAFTA adored Kubrick about as much as the Academy, nominating him for his previous 4 films from Doctor Strangelove to Barry Lyndon, and on his own home turf still, they denied Kubrick recognition in every category for The Shining. The man only got 2 directing nominations for this movie. The first was, can you believe it, the Razzie Award for Worst Director. At the Razzie's very first ceremony, they nominated The Shining for Worst Director, Stanley Kubrick, and Worst Actress, Shelley Duvall, a couple of non-accolades I have taken great issue with for years and have talked about in detail in a recent video. Thankfully, in 2022, they rescinded Duvall's Worst Actress nomination, but still, shame on them. Kubrick's second nomination for The Shining was, hey, a positive one, at the Saturn Awards, which recognized the best in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. In 1981, they nominated The Shining in 4 categories: Best Director for Kubrick, Best Horror Film, Best Music, and Best Supporting Actor for Scatman Crothers, who won at the 8th Saturn Awards for his memorable performance. So I guess at least there was that. However minor it was, at least The Shining got that one well-deserved awards win. At the end of the day, in the case of The Shining, the big award it ultimately won goes far beyond anything it could have been nominated for at the 53rd Academy Awards. The Shining for many nowadays, and that includes myself, is more than a mere movie. It is a breathtaking, terrifying all-timer classic, and no matter how many critics might have hated on the movie back in 1980, Time is the big award The Shining won. Enough time to pass for people to recognize just how special this movie is. Time to grow the positive word of mouth. Time to understand that horror films like this one don't come around ever. The Shining really is not an Oscar fiasco at all. There is nothing fiasco about it. It is one of my favorite films of all time, and I don't know about you, but I hear The Shining calling to me to give it yet another Halloween watch. Here's Johnny. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments below, what are your thoughts on Stanley Kubrick's The Shining? Do you think it should have gotten into the Oscars like Psycho, Carrie, and The Exorcist before it? We'll see you next time at the awards contender.